is all stuff that everybody used to think was conspiracy. This is stuff where people are just delusional. They believe all kinds of wacky conspiracies.
I could maybe forgive people who were associating with Epstein before the conviction. Maybe they didn't know. This guy's on a sex offender registry. Like, This is all in the public sphere.
One Google search.
And you're still hanging around with him?
Hey, thanks for tuning back in to Genuine Questions. Sorry it's been a little while since I've posted a video. I had a couple things hold me up. There were a few production issues, but then there were a few recent events that were related to this topic that I want to talk about, which is Event 201, that has turned this into a much longer episode. So we're going to have a multi-part series here to get into Event 201, Bill Gates, and all the related coincidences that have occurred. Speaking of recent events, that got me thinking about how there's not really a disagreement anymore that there is impending fascism coming to the United States. The big disagreement that people seem to have is just who are the good guys, so to speak. So I don't know who the good guys are, but we're going to talk in these videos about who I think some of the bad guys definitely are, that we should be watching out for. And I have a lot of time to think about this stuff, and one of these recurring thoughts that I have is that I cannot think of any historical or fictional example of an instance where the major news was being controlled and used as propaganda, and that was being done by the good guys. And I'm going to give 3 examples, one from history, fiction, and then what I see as reality to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So obviously, just throughout history, you've got Nazi Germany. It was Hitler who was using the mainstream media as the propaganda to manipulate the majority of the German population into going along with the Holocaust, whether gaslighting them into thinking it wasn't happening or justifying it. Whatever the propaganda was, that was a big component of how that genocide was achieved. I don't know for sure what their propaganda said. I wasn't there, but I imagine that some version of or combination of those 2 tactics is what you would need to push onto the public to get them to comply, look the other way, or justify your horrific actions. From fiction, I like the Harry Potter books, and I think about how like the newspaper, the Daily Prophet, to the wizarding community, that's overtaken by the bad guys, and they're pushing out the story to the wizarding world that Harry's just this attention-seeking teenager that's making up stories because he can't handle that nobody cares about him and he's not being famous anymore. But Harry's really just trying to tell the truth, and it's all of him and his friends who are the minority of the people in society, and they're the ones who are getting ostracized and have to have their underground news network. And it's not even that the people that read these newspaper articles and believe it, that they're bad people. Even Ron's mom, in one of them, she sort of turns on Hermione based on a newspaper article that she's read about her. I think that is a good story that shows how influential that mainstream media is, and how, just again, another example of the bad guys controlling it to manipulate the majority of people into thinking that they're doing something for the greater good, when in reality, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, so they say. And then the way that I just look at reality is to generalize this in the most basic way possible. Don't come at me. I understand that there's all sorts of nuance. I'm just talking broad strokes here. If you got your left versus your right, people on the right think the mainstream media that we are dealing with is fake news, that's controlled by the left. And then people on the left, they hate corporate billionaires. They're greedy. They're responsible for all the world's problems. We got to eat the rich. Capitalism is evil. And there's only 6 rich people that control and own basically all the major news stations. So the way that I would look at it is, no matter where you're coming from, either if you truly are principled and believe what you spout in Facebook arguments online, then neither side should really be happy with the current setup that our news is operating under. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so we'll get back to Event 201 here. And I don't remember who told me about Event 201 or when in this process that I've been looking into this stuff that I even learned about it. But what it is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation hosted a practice pandemic 4 months before the COVID outbreak. And their fictional scenario that they were practicing was, what if there was a pandemic caused by a coronavirus that gets transmitted from a bat to a human? Which is, according to the mainstream story that I'm supposed to believe, if I am not a crazy conspiracy theorist, that's exactly what ended up happening 4 months later. And it was at the time, to my knowledge still is, posted right there on their foundation's website. And I took some screenshots of the parts of it that I thought were interesting. Feel free to go look it up for yourself if you think that I'm taking any of this out of context on a quest to take down Bill Gates. Event 201 simulates an outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus transmitted from bats to pigs to people that eventually becomes efficiently transmissible from person to person, leading to a severe pandemic. The pathogen and the disease it causes are modeled largely on SARS, but is more transmissible in the community setting by people with mild symptoms. There's no possibility of a vaccine being available in the first year. There is a fictional antiviral drug that can help the sick, but not significantly limit the spread of the disease. This is starting to sound a lot like how COVID played out. Since the whole human population is susceptible, during the initial months of the pandemic, the cumulative number of cases increases exponentially, doubling every week. And as the cases and deaths accumulate, the economic and societal consequences become increasingly severe. The scenario ends at the 18th month point with 65 million deaths. The pandemic is beginning to slow due to the decreasing number of susceptible people. The pandemic will continue at some rate until there is an effective vaccine or until 80 to 90% of the global population has been exposed. From that point on, it is likely to be an endemic childhood disease, which is what the flu is. It would be similar to the flu. The Event 201 pandemic exercise, conducted on October 18, 2019, vividly demonstrated a number of these important gaps in pandemic preparedness, as well as some of the elements of the solutions between the public and private sectors that will be needed to fill them. The exercise consisted of pre-recorded news broadcasts, live staff briefings, and moderated discussions on specific topics. The issues were carefully designed in a compelling narrative that educated the participants and the audience. So what they're saying here is that as part of this exercise, they had these mock news segments that they were showing of like what stage the virus would be at and how you would be educating the public and communities on how to slow the spread, flatten the curve, so to speak, of this pandemic that was occurring. And they had mock live staff briefing and moderated discussion on specific topics, which sounds a lot like your beers with Brashear or wine with DeWine, snacking with Acton. I don't think they had a dumb name for the daily Andrew Cuomo press conferences, but that's all you watched on TV all day long was some sort of news update about what's going on with the coronavirus. And the discussions were very narrowly tailored on what was appropriate science to discuss. So I want to go back to what I was saying a couple minutes ago about how there's no instances of the good guys being the ones that are using the mass media to propagandize the public. Because that's a really good way to brainwash and manipulate people, is to, if that is what you wanted to do to them, to isolate them and make them rely on you for information to the outside world, because everybody's on a lockdown for 2 months and you're not going to work and you're not supposed to socialize with any of your family and friends. So I'm not accusing them of doing this. I'm just saying that would be a brilliant way if your goal was to propagandize the public. That would be a brilliant way to achieve it. And then when you think back to a movie like The Hunger Games or V for Vendetta, when they sort of show you how the news is being used as propaganda by these elite people in charge, one of the common things that they do is anybody who's telling the truth, they just label that person as a crazy conspiracy theorist, and they say what they're telling you is the propaganda and misinformation. It's what they always do, and this is a tactic that they also discussed during Event 201, and based on the way that the pandemic ended up playing out, it seemed that they were much more effective at controlling this misinformation than they were, say, actually stopping the spread of the pandemic that they were practicing for. Governments and the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis- and disinformation prior to the next pandemic response. Governments will need to partner with traditional and social media companies to research and develop approaches to countering misinformation. This will require developing the ability to flood media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. Trusted, influential private sector employers should create the capacity to readily and reliably augment public messaging, manage rumors and misinformation, and amplify credible information to support emergency public communications. Media companies should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and that false messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology. This is something that I really want to talk about, because freedom of the press was intended for the media to be able to hold the government accountable to the people. The media is supposed to be acting as a watchdog on the government. They're not supposed to be acting as a mouthpiece for the government. They're not supposed to be promoting what the intelligence agencies say. They're supposed to be debunking what the intelligence agencies say. And think of all the times that the government has lied to us about things that they have been involved in, like weapons of mass destruction, Monica Lewinsky, Watergate. The original authoritative stories are never true. It takes an investigative journalist to dig a little deeper and ask a few questions to uncover the truth. If we were listening to the original authoritative stories, then everybody would think that Benghazi happened because of a YouTube video. But it was because of some investigative journalist and some Freedom of Information Act requests that we learned that that is not what happened. But in the interest of fairness to hearing these authoritative sources out, let's look at how the fact checkers have covered Event 201. Fact check. A Bill Gates-backed pandemic simulation in October did not predict COVID-19. To be clear, the Center for Health Security and Partners did not make a prediction during our tabletop exercise, the university program said in a statement rejecting the claim that it predicted the current pandemic. We are not now predicting that the COVID-19 outbreak will kill 65 million people, the center added. The center further stated that the results of the scenario cannot be used to project for the COVID-19 outbreak because the inputs we use for modeling the potential impact of that fictional virus are not similar to COVID-19. The origins and severity of the fictional pandemic differ from the current outbreak, as do the reactions of national governments and historic institutions. So a couple of things here. First of all, the origins of the fictional pandemic do not really differ from what they are telling us happened with the current outbreak. In the Event 201, it went from a bat to a pig to a human through a wet market. And in real life, it just went from a bat to a human. That's not that different. But thanks for the fact check. And then the only other thing that they even say to debunk this here is the severity of it is going to be different. But there's a lot of other similarities that they just ignored here, and it seems like the sum of their investigation would be akin to calling up O.J. Simpson and asking if he killed his wife, and he says no, and he say, oh, well, we debunked it. We asked the person accused. We called Bill Gates. We called the foundation that put on the exercise and asked them if there was anything sinister about it, and they said no, so debunked. Like, that's a ridiculous thing to call a fact check. But they say, our ruling, false. Although Event 201 was a real event affiliated with high-profile medical professionals, business leaders, and government actors, the claim that the event predicted the current pandemic or is tied to it directly in some way is unfounded. We rate this claim false because it's not supported by our research. There's no reason to believe that the current pandemic will resemble the Event 201 simulation, despite coincidences in the modeling and the timing of the simulation. So throughout this video, we're going to be keeping track of the number of coincidences that are going to be surrounding Bill Gates. So right now we're up to 1. That's event 201 occurring 4 months before the COVID outbreak. Just nothing but a coincidence here, and maybe one day if I have some free time, I'll go up and tally the number of coincidences that have followed Hillary Clinton throughout her political rise to power and see which of these two are the bigger beneficiaries of happenstance. A small but interesting coincidence that I noticed is that in 2019, Bill Gates made a video for Netflix where there was an imagined wet market in China where live and dead animals are stacked and a highly deadly virus erupts that spreads globally. So, again, predicting the future. These next few footnotes I'm going to show you are going to account for coincidence 3 through 6. It's an interesting fact pattern we got here. So, the Gates Foundation monies via CEPI are financing the development of a new vaccine method known as messenger RNA. What do you know? As Bill Gates is practicing for what to do with the coronavirus outbreak, there just happens to then be a coronavirus outbreak, and he's been funding the brand new vaccine technology for it. Wow. They're also co-funding the Cambridge, Massachusetts biotech company Moderna to develop a vaccine against the Wuhan novel coronavirus. Another company which is connected to Bill Gates has been profiting wildly off of this pandemic. Moderna's other partner is the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, a part of National Institutes of Public Health, which is Dr. Fauci's organization. So another star of the pandemic just happened to be funding the mRNA vaccine technology. The Gates Foundation and related entities such as CEPI constitute the largest funders of the WHO. Its current director is the first WHO director in history who is not a medical doctor. He worked for years on HIV with the Gates Foundation, and he is one of the leading fighters of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the first time in history that the WHO has a director who's not a medical doctor, it just happens to be somebody who is connected to the Gates Foundation, and coincides right at the time that Bill Gates is the largest funder of the WHO. So I wonder if the money that Bill Gates is donating to the WHO gives him any sort of influence over world health. I wonder. So I'm not going to count this necessarily as a coincidence, because I guess if you were truly trying to practice for a pandemic and wanted to actually help stop the global spread of it if it did occur, these maybe reasonably would be the people that you would invite to a type of exercise like this. But I still want to go through this list of who some of these players were in this fictional scenario, because I think it's a pretty interesting cast of characters, and if you decided you want to add on a coincidence bonus point at the end of these videos here, go for it. And most of these people, I'm not even going to try to pronounce their names because I'm going to mess it up. So you can read their name for yourself. I'll just tell you what they do and why I think it's relevant. George Fugao was the general director for the Chinese CDC, and he's interested in virus ecology, especially the relationship between live poultry markets and the bat-derived virus ecology. Stephen Redd was Deputy Director for Public Health Service and Implementation Science at the CDC. He aided in the effort to vaccinate 81 million people against the flu. Adrian Thomas was the Vice President for Global Public Health at Johnson & Johnson. This guy is the president of the Global Development Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and his program focuses on 5 areas: family planning, maternal, newborn, and child health, nutrition, polio, and vaccine delivery, and he serves on various advisory boards, including the advisory committee to the director at the CDC. So again, another person that's tight with Bill Gates, just happens to get to be a advisor to the director of the CDC. So I wonder if the Bill Gates's connections and the money that he donates gives him any sort of influence over the U.S. Center for Disease Control in addition to the World Health Organization. You had Timothy Grant Evans, who is the assistant director at the WHO and the director of health equity theme at the Rockefeller Foundation, and the co-founder of the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization, so Gavi. And you might remember from our first episode that we did about Bill Gates and Gavi's disastrous vaccine program in India. You got Latoya Abbott, who's the director of the Occupational Health and Wellness Institute. She implemented a streamlined process to vaccinate hospital employees, which led to a 3-fold increase in the flu vaccination rates. This lady was the chief of staff at a major media company, and she began her career working for CBS and NBC affiliates. And Matthew Harrington is a global chief operating officer at a communications firm that partners with businesses to evolve, promote, and protect their brands and reputations. So again, that's one of those people like Olivia Pope from Scandal, a PR, a crisis consultant, a media spin doctor, got invited to their pandemic pathogen prevention exercise. I don't know what a PR crisis consultant can do necessarily to help with that. The only person that would be a PR crisis for would be the person who would have been responsible for the outbreak. Now, I want to pause for a minute before I get to the last two, which are my favorites. But for the sake of the argument, let's just consider this from the conspiracy theorist viewpoint and assume that the authoritative sources are the ones that are peddling the misinformation. So let's assume that life is like a Hunger Games or a Harry Potter movie, and the media is pushing the propaganda for the bad guys. On this team, you have the head of the Chinese CDC, a country that most people agree is not a friend to the United States, and a guy whose areas of expertise all just happen to coincide with what the authoritative sources were pushing as the origin story. You have various people who were successful in mass vaccine implementation and who are connected to both Bill Gates and Big Pharma. You got a team of media and PR crisis consultants and people involved with the CDC and the Rockefeller Foundation, which are both organizations that have a history of using their position as public health organizations and charities to push a eugenics agenda. Sort of like the concept of smallpox blankets, where you are taking a community that you are trying to eradicate and you act like you're doing them a favor, but really you are stabbing them in the back. Sort of what the CDC did with the Tuskegee experiment, and that's what these organizations have done with their power and have really never been held accountable for. But I'll get back to why that is relevant in a couple of minutes. Because for now, I just want to focus on the basic conspiracy that this pandemic was orchestrated by people who wanted to profit off the vaccine. So the plan would be to release a virus, even if it's not that deadly, use the news and propaganda to push out the message you want, scare everybody, to get everybody excited to take this vaccine, and you make massive profits off of it. Whether you just get people to want to take it, you force them to take it through loss of their job or not being able to go to concerts, whatever means necessary, we'll just keep it basic greed as the motivation here. So if you take that possibility and you couple it with the two videos that we did on the lab leak theory and how it's at least equally likely that this was a man-made virus, and then the video that we cover about the corruption in Big Pharma, that's a pretty suspicious cast of characters that's here practicing for how to prevent a pandemic. It's not a whole lot of scientists or epidemiologists that were invited. And it's pretty interesting coincidence that they're the ones who are practicing for a pandemic that ended up happening 4 months later and just resulted in the largest upward transfer of wealth in human history and huge profits for Big Pharma, but didn't really accomplish anything noteworthy in terms of helping curb the spread of the pandemic. But another interesting thing that I noticed that those people all had in common was that when Event 201 was occurring in 2019, those people were all currently employed at their jobs. So if there was an actual viral outbreak, they would have been in the position to affect change and maybe implement some policies that could have been helpful if they had a plan for it. But that's not true of one of these participants. The next one I want to talk about here, Avril Haines. So during the last administration, which is referring to the Obama administration, she served as assistant to the president and principal deputy national security advisor. She worked as the deputy director of the CIA and legal advisor to the National Security Council. This woman is a career intelligence official, and if you've been watching these videos, you know that I think the credibility of the U.S. intelligence community is less than 0. So not excited to have her on the team. But she's interesting to me because she did those jobs under the Obama administration. During Event 201, as far as we know, she was unemployed. So I'm not sure why at that time in 2019, Bill Gates would have thought she would be an interesting or helpful person who could have added some sort of liaison between the government and the philanthropic organizations. I'm not sure what her role would have necessarily been at all, or why they would have invited a current intelligence officer. But I thought it was interesting. I went and looked up what she's up to now, and she is currently under the Biden administration, the Director of National Intelligence. So she's back in the intel community. So she ended up being useful after all. And the last player I want to talk about here was the chair of the G7+, which was a role that was critical in the negotiations on the 2030 agenda. And that's what I want to finish up this first video here talking about, is the Agenda 2030 agenda. Because a lot of times people say it's a conspiracy theory, that it's the implementation of a one world government. And I want to go look into that, and these are all, again, screenshots that are right off their website, where it's in their own words what they're trying to do. And I'm going to read through a couple of them here that I thought were interesting, and we can decide if we think that this is a crazy conspiracy theory, that this is going to be a one world government, or if maybe the people who think that are actually onto something. We, the heads of state and government and high representatives, meeting at the United Nations headquarters in New York from the 25th of September to the 27th of September 2015, as the organization celebrates its 70th anniversary, have decided today on new global sustainable development goals. On behalf of the peoples we serve, we have adopted a historic decision on comprehensive, far-reaching, and people-centered set of universal and transformative goals and targets. We commit ourselves to working tirelessly for the full implementation of this agenda by 2030. This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance. It is accepted by all countries and is applicable to all, taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development, and respecting national policies and priorities. These are universal goals and targets which involve the entire world, developed and developing countries alike. So, just starting there on page 1, about how this is accepted by all countries and applicable to all, certainly sounds like you could start to qualify that as some sort of one world government or agreement. The new goals and targets will come into effect on January 1st, 2016. So we actually have a specific start date when these policies can start to be enforced. It says, and will guide the decisions we take over the next 15 years. All of us will work to implement the agenda within our own countries and at the regional and global levels, taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development, and respecting national policies and priorities. I believe here in this next point they are talking about the Paris Climate Agreement that everybody was in a fuss about. It says, looking ahead at the COP21 conference in Paris in December, we underscore the commitment of all states to work for an ambitious and universal climate agreement. We reaffirm that the protocol, another legal instrument or agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties, shall address in a balanced manner mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology development and transfer, and capacity building and transparency of action and support. The new agenda recognizes the need to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies that provide equal access to justice and that are based on respect for human rights, on effective rule of law and good governance at all levels, and on transparent, effective, and accountable institutions. Factors which give rise to violence, insecurity, and injustice, such as inequality, corruption, and poor governance, and illicit financial and arms flows, are addressed in the agenda. The scaling ambition of the new agenda requires a revitalized global partnership to ensure its implementation. We fully commit to this. This partnership will work in a spirit of global solidarity, in particular solidarity with the poorest and with people in vulnerable situations. It will facilitate an intensive global engagement in support of implementation of all the goals and targets, bringing together governments, the private sector, civil society, and the United Nations systems, and other actors, and mobilizing all available resources. We acknowledge also the essential role of national parliaments through their enactment of legislation and adoption of budgets, and their role in ensuring accountability for the effective implementation of our commitments. So our tax dollars are going to be used to implement legislation to support this agenda. Government and public institutions will also work closely on implementation with regional and local authorities, sub-regional institutions, international institutions, academia, philanthropic organizations, volunteer groups, and others. What we are announcing today, an agenda for global action for the next 15 years, is a charter for people and planet in the 21st century. Children and young women and men are critical agents of change and will find in the new goals a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation for a better world. So Goal 16 is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And the action steps that you would take to achieve this goal are end child abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children, promote the rule of law at the national and international levels, and ensure equal access to justice for all. By 2030, significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, and combat all forms of organized crime. And if you watch the Plato o Plomo episode of Genuine Questions, you'll know exactly what I think organized crime in the present day is all about. Substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. Develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. I'm just saying, if this is one of your number one goals is to end child exploitation and human trafficking, I would think Bill Gates, one of your largest funders, should be one of the first people that you should talk to and ask him about his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. Maybe we shouldn't just stop at Ghislaine Maxwell and sentencing her to 20 years for selling children to nobody. Why don't we get a look at the client list and start prosecuting the people who are the market for this perversion, if you're actually serious about stopping global human trafficking. And final point I want to read, we reaffirm our strong commitment to the full implementation of this new agenda. We recognize that we will not be able to achieve our ambitious goals and targets without a revitalized and enhanced global partnership and comparably ambitious means of implementation. The revitalized global partnership will facilitate an intensive global engagement in support of implementation of all the goals and targets, bringing together government, civil society, the private sector, the United Nations systems, and other actors, and mobilizing all available resources. So I'm not so sure that I think those people are crazy conspiracy theorists, because that certainly sounds to me like something that would constitute a global agreement, a one world government. And when we don't have a say in who these other people are on this committee who are getting to decide these laws that apply to all, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. You don't want to give global power into such a small, concentrated group, because how do we have any, especially with the press and the media that we have right now, how do we have any accountability, any way to have accountability over these people? How can you not acknowledge that that's at least a possibility, and one that we should potentially be concerned about and not get complacent, because history does tend to repeat itself. That's the end of what I have here for this first video. Hope you guys come back for the next videos, because we have some more coincidences to add to the counter. And when you put them all together, it paints a pretty interesting picture that everybody should be asking a few genuine questions about.
This Epstein case is probably the most blatant example of a public murder of a crucial witness I've ever seen in my entire life, and the minimal amount of outrage.
This was shaping up to be the biggest news story in history, and the instant he died, the story just fell off the face of the earth.